Opening a copper-covered ancient book, the vortex inside instantly sucked Roy in. When Roy opened his eyes again, he found that he had actually crossed into the kingdom of elves, dwarves, Cana, orcs, human knights, wizards, priests. This is a magical world. Keywords of the novel. Road of Light with no pop-ups. Download the complete collection of Road of Light TXT, and read the latest chapters of Road of Light. Chapter 1. Moonlight in the City. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. Moonlight in the City. Roy sat on the granite fence by the bridge, legs resting on the outside, and the clear water of the Dane River flowed straight into the endless sea. A crescent moon in the night sky, like a hook, shines like snow on this small town. The street looks very deserted, with carriages passing by from time to time. This is the natural harbor of Castleton, which is only 200 kilometers away from the city of Buenos Aires. The sound of three-masted sailboats setting sail echoed in the distance, with a clear and crisp sound. Now it happened to be the time of high tide. The time when ships on the dock set sail varies with the tides. I have been in this world for almost a year now, and I am not a qualified traveler. Roy chuckled self-deprecatingly. Others can use soap made from lamb oil, olive oil squeezed from olives, salt baked from the beach, and cooking delicious dishes can change their lives, but what about themselves? The level of civilization in this world exceeds Roy's imagination, with magnificent carriages scattered on the streets, three-masted sailboats several tens of meters long moored in the harbor, and an airport dock outside the city. Airships hover beside the towering towers, creating a magical world. Magicians are just a special profession here, and Roy has seen those elf magicians wearing robes on the street more than once. Roy felt like a bumpkin from the countryside, so out of place with the elves in this city. Ms. Belinda, the mother, is a pure-blooded silver moon elf. She told Roy that your father is a wandering bard from the other side of the endless sea, known as the Green Empire. Therefore, you are a mixture of elves and humans, but you look more like humans. In fact, you are a half-elf. But every time she said these things, it was almost always Ms. Belinda who drank a little alcohol, making it difficult for Roy to distinguish whether it was actually drunk or not. Roy didn't feel like he was. He didn't inherit any of the traits of elves, and his body grew very fast. Although he often drank the juice of the tree of life, he still grew very fast. Roy's house is on a long street near the sea in Port Castleton, and the Dane River flows under the bridge at the intersection. The location here is relatively low in the city, and it is considered as a civilian residential area in the city. Every time there is a rainstorm, the rainwater gathered from high places will turn the streets here into torrential streams. The shimmering river water echoed with the sound of ding-ding-dong, as if playing cheerful music. Roy let out a sigh. Even in a magical elf world, life should still be lived. Roy was also doubting whether this could be a dream. He had tried to awaken himself in different ways, such as standing in an incredibly noisy square and shouting loudly, challenging Mrs. Winnie, the owner of a pharmacy on the street, to keep her pet. The Nightblade Leopard. Now he is sitting on the railing of this stone bridge at the street corner, watching the flowing Dane River, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath, with his arms outstretched. Wake up, Roy. Roy, who opened his arms, imagined himself as a seagull, leaping into the cold river with a deep leap put on at the moment of falling into the river. Roy consciously fell into a blank mind. The cold river water enveloped his body, but when he opened his eyes, he found himself still soaking in the river water. His feet had already touched the soft mud at the bottom of the river. He vigorously splashed and poured several mouthfuls of water, finally climbing to a step on the shore before exhaustion. The stone platform here is a place where neighbors usually wash clothes and fetch water, but fortunately there is no one at night, otherwise Roy might be embarrassed. He lay weakly on the slate, panting for breath. The wet clothes sticking to his body were very uncomfortable, and the slate was a bit cold, but it made him more conscious than usual. Although expected earlier, Roy still had some disappointment in his heart. It seems really impossible to go back. Roy, is that you? Beside the fence by the river, a elf woman's head peeked out, with pointed ears and a silk headscarf wrapped around her head. She looked at the steps with a skeptical expression. "Ha, good evening, Mrs. Gillian." Roy recognized that the elf woman happened to be the neighbor, Mrs. Gillian, and immediately sat up from the stone steps, gathering her energy to answer. "Do you need any help?" "Oh, no need, I want to try the night swimming." Roy tried hard to squeeze out a smile, his elf language still a bit stiff. "Okay, whatever you want." Madame Gillian saw that Roy was still lively and didn't seem to take it too seriously, so she ignored him and pushed the cart towards the dock. It happened to be high tide now, and there would be fishing boats returning from outside on the dock. She wanted to go to the fishing boats to collect some sea fish. Ms. Gillian is Roy's neighbor who sells mackerel at the port fish market. If there's anything in this city that makes Roy feel good about it, it's that eating fish is really cheap. Occasionally, Ms. Gillian would bring the leftover mackerel back home and share it with Roy when she's in a good mood. "The fresh sea fish here won't be so fishy. Just marinate it with a little salt, sprinkle some pepper and lemon juice, and when fried, the taste will be super great. The elves here only eat fish and fruits, and their diet is very healthy. It is rare to see elf chubby people." Roy walked wet all over the street, and the night wind blew over. He couldn't help but shiver, feeling that running a few steps could drive away the chill. After his clothes got wet, they stuck to his body, making it particularly heavy to run. Roy's house is across the street, a standalone 2-story wooden building with no lights inside the windows. Ms. Belinda has not returned yet. Recently, the art museum has been very busy. Even when I go home, I just take a quick shower, change into clean clothes, and sleep for a night before disappearing. Elves like Roy's age are usually still receiving Enlightenment education at home, but his current appearance looks like a human youth of 17 or 18 years old. The lifespan of elves is about 800 years, but it is said that half-elves like Roy can live to 300 years old. Even those who pay attention to maintenance in their daily lives may not live to over 400 years old. For Roy, he suddenly realized that he could live for 300 years, which was no different from immortality. The journey of life was really long. For Ms. Belinda, a reality she has to face is that Roy's lifespan is less than half that of a normal elf, and she is likely to die before herself. Every time she thinks of this, Ms. Belinda becomes sentimental for a while. Ms. Belinda believed that Roy was precocious and could attend school earlier than other elves, so she decided to allocate some money to support Roy's education. The Elf Academy in Castleton advocates freedom, and students who enter the academy can freely choose courses. They can start by taking some less important elective courses, which can also be considered as finding something to do for Roy. The elves in this port city live an extremely casual and slow-paced life, but everyone has plenty of time. Elves enjoy a free and easy life, fishing, gardening, singing, dancing, listening to music, and attending various gatherings. However, living in the city inevitably incurs some expenses. High-level elves know how to enjoy life, and only those living at the bottom need to work. Ms. Belinda is an assistant to a sculptor and usually works in an art museum. "When I'm free, I'm too idle. When I'm busy, I spend almost all day in the art museum," just like now. Pushing open the door, moonlight shone through the window. Although the corner was pitch black, the decorations in the living room could still be seen clearly. Against the wall was a wooden square table with only 2 chairs, and the living room floor was covered with a thick sheepskin carpet. The windowsill was filled with flower pots, filled with tiny white stars blooming inside. On the left side of the living room is Roy's room, on the right side is the kitchen. Ms. Belinda's room is on the 2nd floor, and there is also a terrace on the 2nd floor that can climb a steep roof. The terrace is also filled with potted plants. In the eyes of the elves, raising flowers is to cultivate their own taste. Shaking off his shoes, he walked barefoot around the milky white wool carpet and into the bathroom next to the kitchen. Standing under the shower, take off your clothes, wash away the mud and water grass sticking to your body, and hastily dry your body. Water needs to be saved a bit, after all, lifting water to the roof is a very difficult task, which has always been Roy's responsibility. Roy changed into clean clothes, soaked the wet clothes in a wooden basin and washed them clean before drying them on the terrace on the second floor. When I walked up to the second floor terrace, I happened to see Moira, the youngest daughter of Mrs. Gillian from my neighbor's house, sitting on the opposite terrace with her hands clasped on her knees, lifting her pointed chin and looking at the silver moon in the night sky. She is a hybrid of the silver moon elf and the night elf, with a slightly dull skin. She awakened early on to the bloodline talent of the night elf of concealment, and at the same time, like other night elves, she is quiet and introverted, and does not like to communicate with others. But this is the kingdom of silver moon elves, and many silver moon elves even reject night elves. Moira, you haven't slept yet so late. Roy casually greeted as he hung his clothes on the clothesline. Moira turned her head and revealed a beautiful face. I slept a bit too much during the day, and now I can't sleep anymore. Roy, I heard you're going to school next week. Well, Belinda thinks I should go to the college early to learn some knowledge. Roy tugged at his slightly wrinkled hem and invited, Moira, should we go together? Let's just wait a little longer, I'm afraid I might not adapt, Moira said shyly, shrinking her head. Roy and Moira chatted casually before going downstairs and returning to their own room. The snowy moonlight fell on the white sheets, sitting on a bed covered in thick vanilla. Roy opened his right hand and looked at the palm of his hand. A firefly-like light appeared in his palm, and he didn't know what it was for. After touching the withered wallet and saving it for a long time, I saved 76 kohlers and thought to myself. Only 24 kohlers are needed to cover the cost of the primary appraisal. Since this is a dream that cannot be awakened. Or not a dream, it is necessary to plan your future life carefully. Roy looked at the faint light in his palm, rubbed his brow, and looked out the window at the city. The snowy moonlight scattered throughout the city. The elves in the city also have high and low status, and the powerful live in the manor, wearing gorgeous clothes and attending various dances. Ordinary elves don't live as carefree as they do. Half-elves and half-elves are considered the lowest status groups in the city. Half-elves like Roy or half-elves like Moira are even a bit discriminated against by other elves. The elven nobles always shout freedom and equality when giving speeches, and in Roy's eyes, everything is nothing but nonsense. But since you have come to this world full of fantasy, you need to walk around and look around. The book has just been applied for. Since it has been applied for, let's take it as a gesture of respect. I'm back. End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Bread and Poetry. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 2. Bread and Poetry. In the morning, wake up. Getting up from a soft bed is a test of willpower. At the entrance to the living room, next to Roy's muddy shoes, there was a finely crafted deer leather boot upside down, with the other boot sticking to the door. It seemed that Ms. Belinda had returned last night, and indeed there was a skirt hanging on the chair. Preparing breakfast is not troublesome, just peel out the breadfruit and prepare a delicious cup of tea. Roy has always believed that breadfruits are a very magical thing. No need for wheat flour or an oven, it's just that this thing doesn't suit Roy's taste, but there's nothing we can do. Everyone eats this. Wheat flour can also be bought in the port of Castleton, but these foods from the human world are very expensive in the elf world, and Roy doesn't even know how to bake bread. The breadfruit eaten by the elves is very different from the one Roy had seen in his past life, except for the same name. This breadfruit is more like a durian. This type of breadfruit grows inside a hard, prickly shell. When it matures, the shell can easily split into 5 petals, and the flesh is like croissant lying inside. However, the flesh of the breadfruit is not too sweet and has a woody fragrance. It can be eaten directly or dipped in salt. Roy broke open a quarter of a breadfruit, first giving himself a portion, and then placing another portion in a porcelain plate. He prepared a cup of honey tea from impatience for Belinda. And he drank a cup of diluted life tree juice, which slowed down aging. In the central garden of Castleton, there is a tree of life that has grown for nearly 5,000 years, and the Silver Moon Elves in the city receive a share there every month. Belinda is always worried that Roy will grow too fast and always says she dreamed that Roy died in her arms, so she insists on letting Roy drink every day. Sitting at the dining table, eating the food on the taste list. Looking back on his time traveling to this world, he was still a third-year student who made a last-minute surprise attack before the final exam. That day, Roy rushed to the library early to take a seat. There were many people in the library, and even though he arrived early, almost all of those desks were filled with various personal books. He walked along rows of bookshelves, curious about how many bookshelves there were in the second-floor library. Soon, his attention focused on them, feeling that he couldn't get to the end no matter how far he went. In the end, I felt like I couldn't see any other classmates around me. I didn't expect there to be such a quiet area in the library, which was really unbelievable. The books on the bookshelf only appear to be in foreign languages, and those words are not English, French, German, Italian, or Japanese, like inexplicable ghost symbols. Take out a heavy copper ancient book casually, with two elves on the cover, one holding a long sword and the other holding a staff. The two of them look up at the crescent moon above their heads. Although I cannot understand the text above, the patterns drawn inside seem to describe the elf world. Actually, Roy is interested in flipping back to see if there are any elf beauties in the illustrations. The slender figures of the elves are very in line with the aesthetic of the Chinese people. He only flipped through a few pages, and the whole book flipped back and forth on its own, faster and faster, like a cash register. In just a few seconds, a book was flipped through from beginning to end. And at the end of the page, there was actually a huge vortex, like a huge black hole. Suddenly, Roy was sucked in, and he had no chance of struggling in calling for help. I don't know how long I slept in the darkness, but when Roy opened his eyes, he found himself in this elf kingdom and even became the son of Ms. Belinda. This elf mother, who doesn't look like him at all, treats him well. However, she is the kind of artistic fairy with some petty bourgeoisie, and almost all the money she earns is used to enjoy life. She is always so sentimental and likes to pursue both material and spiritual enjoyment. She often wears beautiful clothes to attend various dances. She is a pure-blooded Silver Moon elf, so after putting on her formal attire, she can always enter various dance parties. Roy can't do it, even if Belinda guarantees that he is a half-elf with Silver Moon elf bloodline. Many guards at the entrance of the ball don't allow such a half-elf who looks like a human to enter. Roy always waits obediently by the flower bed at the entrance of the dance venue and comforts Belinda that she doesn't like dancing at all. How come there are elves who don't like dancing? Ms. Belinda believed that it must have been Roy comforting her, but the number of times Belinda took Roy to the ball gradually decreased. Recently, Ms. Belinda found a new job and became an assistant to a sculptor in the city. Although she does some miscellaneous work every day, this job with a strong artistic atmosphere is very suitable for her. Ms. Belinda was wearing a cool nightgown, yawning barefoot as she walked down the stairs. Her snow-white arms were almost completely exposed, and her nightgown was pressed against her slender body, not covering too much. She almost always dresses like this when she's at home. For a Silver Moon elf who is not yet 300 years old, she is still very young, if she happens to be 20.8 or 9 years old in the human world. She has silver long hair and a loose ball on her head, with heavy eye bags under her blue eyes. Every time she lacks sleep, her eyes become slightly swollen. She is not the kind of elf with an extremely beautiful appearance, but she excels in understanding herself, dressing up, and always exuding a sense of intelligence in herself. Sitting at the dining table, he first looked up and down at Roy, then picked up honey tea and took a sip before using a spoon to dig out the breadfruit from the plate to eat. Watching her eat breadfruits feels like she's eating ice cream. How was yesterday? Ms. Belinda wanted to pinch Roy's cheek, but Roy turned her head away. That's it, I want to go fishing by the seaside today. Roy put down the spoon in his hand and said his plan. Belinda hesitated for a moment before saying, okay, but don't pick up those shellfish on the rocks anymore. They taste like slugs and make me feel nauseous at a glance. Roy shrugged and said, okay. Actually, that thing is really delicious, especially with a little lemon juice. Then it was time for Ms. Belinda to nag. Like all mothers, Ms. Belinda always has one kind of expectation for Roy. You need to learn the appearance and habits that elves should have, after all, you live in the elven kingdom. I really don't know where you learned these human habits from. Is it because the human talent hidden in your body has awakened? Ms. Belinda felt helpless about this. Thinking of the task assigned to Roy, Ms. Belinda asked him. Have you finished reading the poetry collection you were asked to read last week? Roy gritted his head and replied, I've looked a little. Actually, Roy can't even remember where the book was in the room. The poetry of the elves thinking about Roy, he feels like he's not doing well anymore. This is not possible, we Silver Moon elves would rather not have bread than poetry. Belinda chattered to Roy. Roy also replied, unwilling to be outdone. I know, you can still eat fish without bread. Breakfast was very simple, just brushing 2 plates and cups, which were almost all done by Roy. After breakfast, Ms. Belinda wore a new dress with maple leaf patterns to work at the art museum. Roy also scrubbed his shoes, which were covered in stinky mud, and hung them on the terrace on the 2nd floor before walking out of his house with a fishing rod and a wooden bucket. He walked downstream along the Dane River to reach the seaside, which is the mouth of the Dane River and a very suitable fishing reef area. Elves don't like to wake up too early, except for those who have to go to the orchard to collect dew in the morning. The street is very quiet, but it is very clean. On one side of this street is the Dane River, and on the other side, there are some wooden houses with shops. The nearest shop to Roy's house is a bakery that sells breadfruits. There are actually many other types of fruits inside, but Roy thinks they cannot be taken out for breakfast, so he only eats breadfruits every morning. There is also a pharmacy on the street corner, with shelves filled with various test tubes and liquids of various colors, many of which are said to be expensive potions. Roy doesn't understand these things, but he is very familiar with the nightblade leopard cub tied up at the pharmacy entrance, and occasionally gives it 1 or 2 sea fish to eat. This street is almost filled with ordinary 2-story wooden houses, many of which have been repainted many times. Living by the seaside is very bad, as if it is wet all year round, and even the wind brings a strong smell of sea smell. Walking further ahead from the street corner, there is a slightly raised rock wall where a Temple of Liberty is built. It is said that every weekend morning, a group of people come to pray, and everyone also sits together to sing. Sabrina, the eldest daughter of neighbor Ms. Jillian, is a member of the choir in the temple. Roy actually always wanted to go inside and take a look, but every time he passed by the door and saw the statue of the goddess holding a scepter in the center of the flower bed in the temple courtyard through the iron fence, his footsteps became hesitant. Roy, standing on the roadside, saw a blurry figure emerge from the corner of the north wall of the temple from afar. He suddenly jumped out of the wall and pounced into the wild grass outside, then disappeared. Roy didn't pay much attention. The thief who dared to climb over the wall in the morning might be an elf secretly dating a priest in the temple. Standing here, you can have a panoramic view of the port. There are more than 10 3-masted sailboats moored on the dock of the port, and there are dozens of small fishing boats. Now that the tide has just receded, only the smallest fishing boat can go out to sea at such low water levels. If a large boat wants to go out to sea, it can only wait for the next big tide. Next to the dock is a golden beach, where the seawater recedes and leaves many shells. Roy ran barefoot, wearing a pair of overalls, rolled up his pants legs, and strode down the beach. The distant sea surface was connected to the sky. Roy first dug some sandworms on the beach and bumped into a wooden bucket. Then he ran to the reef area by the sea with a fishing rod and climbed onto a huge reef closest to the sea. There were oysters scattered on this reef, and many places were very prickly. Only a few places could be settled, which Roy gradually cleared out. This is where he goes fishing. Standing on the reef, Roy looked towards the end of the sea, thinking about what kind of kingdom there was on the other side of the sea. End of this chapter. Chapter 3. The Gift of the Sea. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3. The Gift of the Sea. Blue sky, white bird. Only in places where the sea and sky are connected, can there be a faint cloud like smoke and mist. The reef area here is almost completely submerged by seawater during high tide, and only appears on the sea surface during low tide. Therefore, the reefs are crowded with oysters and sea rainbow, and the elves do not like to eat shellfish, resulting in almost all of the shore reef area being occupied by oysters. Every once in a while, Roy cleans up the shellfish growing from his fishing spot, but this is a rocky area with abundant shellfish, so there are also many fish hidden in the crevices. Fishing here, besides being careful with the hook hanging at the bottom, is almost the best spot. The wind is a little strong, and the tide has not yet risen, but the waves hit the rocks on the shore one by one, turning into countless spray and foam. Those tiny pieces of sea water drift away with the wind, making the whole coastline filled with a sea flavor. Roy hung a piece of sandworm on the fishing hook and forcefully threw the fishing line into a narrow sea below the reef. Every time the waves surged in along the narrow crevices, they would flow out again after a while. If there is a high tide, you will find a dark pit surrounded by surrounding rocks, which is only about 10 square meters in size and contains some black snappers. Elves cook delicious fish dishes, preferring to peel off the skin of the fish, remove the meat from the spine, marinate it with salt and pepper for a while, then fry it in oil, and drizzle it with some pre-made sauce. However, they eat fish with fewer bones, so that the cooking is not so boring. This type of black snapper is a bit troublesome to cook, and only 2 fish shops are willing to purchase it when it comes to the market on the dock. Usually, Roy would occasionally place a bucket at the entrance of the fish market and sell it to the elves who came to buy fish at the market. However, those elves were more picky, so Roy would rather sell the fish for less money and directly take them to the fish shop, where he could go at any time. In just one morning, Roy caught half a bucket of fish. In addition to some black snappers, there was also a beautiful 3-knife fish that Roy planned to steam and eat at night. As it approached noon, the tide began to rise again, and the seawater kept crashing against the reef walls, gradually devouring the reef area. Roy knew that it would be very troublesome to wait until the sea rose before wading, as there were shark shells everywhere. He put away his fishing rod, carried a heavy bucket, carefully climbed down from the reef, and walked towards the fish market at the pier on the soft beach. The pier of Castleton Port is not particularly large, with rows of fishing boats of all sizes moored on the pier less than 300 meters away. Some are wooden boats that can only fish in the near sea, while others are sailboats that can fish in the far sea. But unlike these fishing boats, they are large sailboats anchored in deep waters, and most of these 3-masted sailboats are commercial ships. They not only brought spices and gems from the south, but also various magical herbs and delicious mushrooms from the eternal night forest in the north. The entire elf continent is occupied by 3 forces, with a group of wooden elves occupying a large area of southern land. They believe in the sons of nature, and most of the wooden elves live on a huge world tree. It is said that the crown of that tree is an extremely prosperous city. The central region has the largest territory, and this is the territory of the Silver Moon Elves. The Silver Moon Elves have always believed that their own tribe is the royal family of the Elves, but it is not recognized by the other 2 elf races. The Eternal Night Forest in the north has always been the territory of the Dark Moon Elves, who are accustomed to living in darkness, and many assassins come from the Eternal Night Forest. Castleton Port is the territory of the Silver Moon Elves, facing the sea 3 times and adjacent to the Gabu Trench, making it a natural harbor. At the bustling fish market, there are not only local elves picking fresh fish, but also some merchant ships from Buena City. They will load the fresh sea fish from the fish market into wooden boxes covered with ice and then transport them to Buenos City. The elves signed a non-invading contract with the Cana sea tribe, so the port of Castleton has gradually developed from a remote fishing village to a bustling fishing port in the past century. On the east side of the dock is a bustling fish market. Many elves don't like the smell of smell, so when they come back from fishing in the sea, they sell it on this beach sandhill, which is close to the dock and has a relatively high terrain. This was originally just a desolate beach, but later more and more elves engaged in trading here, gradually transforming into a prosperous fish market. Now some stone slabs have been laid here, and even small wooden houses or sunshades have been built in some places. Ms. Angeli's fish stall is equipped with a sunshade, but she is more willing to purchase large sea fish caught by large fishing boats from the open sea. She is not very interested in Roy's black snappers, and Roy usually does not send the caught fish to her place. Roy has his own sales channels, and the vendor who is willing to buy his products is a restaurant owner. In addition to having a stall in the fish market, he also opened a restaurant in the city. One of the specialties of that restaurant is the dish of steamed snapper. Of course, there is also a small suggestion from Roy that will give this dish a unique flavor. The black snapper caught by Roy also has a stable sales market, but the purchase price is still very low. 2 coals per piece, regardless of size. Of course, even if Roy catches a black snapper smaller than 2 slaps, he will throw it back into the sea. Roy carried a bucket and walked through the bustling fish market in the port of Castleton, greeting familiar faces proactively. The elves in the fish market are all ordinary people, and the nobles will not come to this dirty and smelly fish market. Many of the elves here are of low-status mixed race. For the Silver Moon elves, their tolerance for half-elves like Roy, who look more like humans, is much higher than that of some mixed-race elves. The elves have a unified title for mixed-race elves, which is blood elves. Unfortunately, the personalities of elves are so artistic that they are easily fully immersed in a new relationship. In the face of new emotions, love has no boundaries. Roy heard that a large number of mixed-race elves had left the elven continent by boat because they couldn't bear the discrimination of the elven continent. Speaking of which, Roy's neighbor Ms. Gillian's 2 daughters are like this. The eldest daughter Sabrina has a bit of wood elf lineage, while the youngest daughter Moira has a bit of dark moon elf lineage. Ms. Gillian, like her mother Belinda, is a Silver Moon elf. The elves in the fish market have long been familiar with Roy, and there are even elves greeting him intimately. Roy, did you go fishing again? Well, Gilu, how's business today? Don't mention it, the fish dealers in Buenos have pushed prices too low. Whenever this happens, Roy feels a bit unsure of what to say. The owner of the fish stall in waterproof leather pants didn't mind at all. He just wanted to roast and had to say that Roy was a good listener. Giru continued to chatter. Our fish market should unite and resist those foreign fish traffickers. Hey, look over there, it seems like another big ship has docked. Roy followed Giro's gaze and saw that another large ship had indeed docked in the deep water area of the dock, taking advantage of the tide. The style of this ship is not only very unconventional, but even the sails are not the white silk fabric commonly used by elves. Instead, they are a type of sail with a dark gray color, and the raised half of the sails are clearly embroidered with patterns of sword shields and griffins. Although the 5-masted sailboat was several hundred meters away from here, Roy could still clearly see that the sailors on board were not sharp-eared elves, but a group of humans who looked somewhat similar to him. These human sailors also stood excitedly on the side of the ship, cheering and waving to the shore. Quickly, Roy carried the bucket to the front of a fish stall. Unlike other fish stalls, the variety of sea fish on this stall was very diverse, and among the customers who gathered here to choose sea fish, there was hardly any trace of the vendors. The vendor is an elderly elf, although it is difficult for time to leave a mark on the elves. From the sparse white hair on his head and some subtle wrinkles on his face, it can still be inferred that he is very old. The lifespan of elves is about 800 years, which does not mean they will live forever. Time will also take away their lives, but an old elf represents a rich life experience, even if he is just a vendor in a fish market. "Did you go fishing again?" the old elf asked Roy kindly. Compared to other young elves, Roy is the kind who is more practical and understands life better. The elves of Castleton live in an environment of abundant resources, and even the poorest elves can afford breadfruits. Elves do not have a high demand for food, and most young elves choose to pursue higher artistic literacy. Let them recite poetry facing the sea. Few young elves like Roy would specifically go fishing at the beach. There are only 14 coals. Roy placed the bucket in front of the old elf's feet. "Pour it in," the old elf said without counting the quantity. Then he counted 14 white shells from the money bag, which was the smallest denomination currency circulating in the Silver Moon Elf Kingdom and an uncommon type of shell. Roy had searched the coastline around the port of Castleton, but at least no shells of this style were found on this beach. Roy put the 14 kohlers in his wallet, which were polished into thin slices and were very lightweight. Roy couldn't help but pat his pocket. If luck were the same tomorrow, the appraisal fee would finally be settled. But what makes Roy more concerned is another matter. Roy, holding a bucket with only a 3-knife fish left, turned around and saw the 5-masted sailboat at the deep water dock. This huge sailboat looked very old, with a bronze eagle lion statue at the collision angle in front of the hull. However, the left wing was broken, and it was covered in green copper rust. It seemed that it should be repaired well. Unlike the exquisite streamlined hull of the elves, the front of this seagoing ship is sharper, while the back of the ship is somewhat square, indicating that it can carry a lot of cargo at a glance. Roy didn't rush home either, but walked towards the deep water dock with a bucket in hand. End of this chapter. Chapter 4. Crew members, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. Crew, thank you for the Silver Alliance with the boss of Shanghai Miao 1. Let's talk about the reward system. The reward is still 10,000 points and an additional chapter will be added. However, the new book period will control the update volume and will be postponed until it is listed. I owe you these 100 chapters for now. I will slowly add 1 chapter per day for the slow code, and add another one. The 1,000-month ticket will also add an additional chapter. Only by walking in front of the big sea ship did Roy truly feel how tall it was. The ship docked longitudinally on the dock, with the brass collision angle almost touching the stone steps, more than 4 meters higher than the dock. The main sail had already been lowered, but the 40-something high main mast was pulled with countless ropes and pulleys. Compared to the exquisite merchant ships of the elves, this ship appears very crude in both its design and facilities, but it is the largest ship that Roy has ever seen in the port of Castleton, with a hull length of over 40 meters. Putting down the bucket in his hand, Roy carefully observed the ship with a deep draft, and it seemed that there should be a lot of cargo loaded on board. The elf patrols on the dock arrived here as soon as possible, and have now climbed up the ladder onto the ship. They should be inspecting the dangerous items on board, such as the ship's armed forces and weapons and equipment. The sailors were still sorting out some wooden crates on the deck, which seemed to be some worthless goods. As long as these goods are not removed from the ship and according to the regulations set by the Silver Moon Elves, there is no need to pay taxes. So Roy did not see the tax officer on the dock on the ship. Just as Roy was standing in front of the dock, staring at the ship in a daze, some well-dressed crew members had already walked down the ladder from the ship. It can be seen that these elf guards are conducting safety checks on the ship smoothly, so there is no order to prohibit these crew members from disembarking. These crew members are almost all wearing leather vests, white shirts, horse pants, and long boots, and do not wear weapons at the waist. Roy saw that the sailors on the bow deck had swords around their waists. These crew members seem to have their hair left untreated for a long time. Many crew members are braided, some are loose, and when the sea breeze blows, it becomes messy. Their hair colors are diverse, with yellow, red, and dark brown appearing the most prominent, each one appearing very strong, at least looking stronger than those elf guards. Probably because Roy is the only person on the dock who looks similar to them. After the crew got off the ship, they didn't wander around casually, but walked straight to Roy's side. The strong crew member led by them also curiously looked at Roy. "Do you need a guide?" Roy asked proactively. He doesn't like to be a guide. In fact, this is still his first time doing this. Mainly to gather some information about the outside world from these distant crew members. Castleton Port is a fishing port, and most of the ships involved in fish trade come here to dock. Even if Roy wanted to gather information, he didn't want to talk to him. #. The strong crew member quickly spoke a string of words towards Roy. Roy looked confused and couldn't understand what he was saying. It seems that communication is not possible. Roy spread out his hand and shook his head slightly, indicating that he was very helpless and couldn't understand. "You don't know Imperial language." A thin and weak young man wearing a black robe emerged from behind the strong crew member. His skin was very white, and he had a pair of glasses on his nose bridge. He was holding a book with a copper cover in his hand, and he asked Roy in an extremely stiff Elvish language. However, his grammar and pronunciation are very problematic, and no elf would arrange words like this. Roy nodded. "I only speak Elven language. Do you need a guide?" he asked the young man in a robe again. At this moment, he realized that there were some dark lines on the black robe, which seemed to be magical lines. Roy guessed that the other party was likely a magician. The magician also waited for Roy to slow down his tone a bit, and then listened carefully twice before saying, "Take us to find a hotel, and after we settle down, take us to find a tavern with local characteristics. We all need to relax a bit." He spoke in rhythmic pauses, sounding like reciting a spell. "No problem," Roy answered quickly. The young wizard discussed with the strong crew member before turning around and asking, "How much compensation do you need to pay you? If possible, tell me about the interesting things you encountered on your journey. Do you want to get some external information? Let's exchange it with each other. We also want to learn about this elf city." The young wizard quickly took the opportunity to say. "This is the port of Castleton in the Silver Moon Elf Kingdom," Roy candidly said. "It's not a secret, just a little inquiry will reveal it." Then he asked again, "Where are you from?" "Green Empire, Qian City. That is the largest southern city in the Green Empire. If you have the opportunity to visit Green Empire, be sure to visit Qian City." The young wizard also answered without hesitation, and then asked, "Is this far from Buenos Aires?" "Not too far. What are you doing here?" Roy asked curiously, without pointing out the specific location of Buenos. The young wizard opened his mouth and said, "Of course it's for trade. We plan to leave the Silver Moon Elf Kingdom." Ahem. Before he could finish speaking, he was interrupted by the strong crew members around him. Obviously, he did not understand the conversation between the magician and Roy, and the magician could only patiently translate it for him to listen to. Then the strong crew member quickly spoke to the wizard again. The magician hesitated for a moment, then carefully organized his language before saying to Roy with a smile, "We're just planning to buy some elf cookies, advanced sword shields, and other products." Roy knew they were not telling the truth, but he also didn't bother to pay attention. After all, everyone is not familiar with each other. Seeing that these crew members were still somewhat wary of him, Roy closed his mouth. Since he agreed to take the other party to find a hotel, Roy didn't say anything. He just introduced them to some hotels in the city, which are roughly divided into 3 levels. There are 2 hotels on Brown Street where Roy lives, but Brown Street belongs to a civilian neighborhood, so the hotels here are also of the lowest grade. Usually, some merchants who purchase sea fish on the dock will stay in the hotels for 1 or 2 nights. However, there are also advantages to it. The advantage lies in its cheap price and proximity to the port terminal. After hearing Roy's introduction, these crew members readily agreed. Roy walked at the front with a bucket in his hand. After leaving the dock, he never passed any shops and would proactively explain to them what these shops were all operating. At least make them distinguish which one is a store and which one is a restaurant. Brown Street is really close to the pier. When Roy passed by the Temple of Liberty with over 20 crew members, they were surprised to see a relatively small temple built on the hillside. Immediately, a crew member couldn't wait to come over and visit, but there was a group of people crowded at the entrance of the temple. Through the crowd, one could still see the priests wearing divine robes inside the temple, who were chatting incessantly with several elf guards about something. It seems that there may be some issues with this temple. When Roy passed by this place in the morning, the temple was still so quiet. A group of people passed by the entrance of the Temple of Liberty, and no one would be foolish enough to look at it with curious eyes. Passing through the Temple of Liberty, Roy finally thought of something and took out a kolar from his pocket. The thin shell was between his thumb and index finger, and Roy introduced it to the crew behind him. The currency used here is kolar, which is polished from this type of shell. Can't gold coins be used? The young wizard asked with a surprised expression on his face. Roy looked at the magician with some envy. He really didn't know what would happen if he traded gold coins in the shop here, because he didn't have any gold coins and had never seen anyone else use them. So Roy said to the wizard, "You can give it a try, I think some elves will like it." Roy took them to a hotel, and sure enough, this hotel doesn't accept gold coins. However, the young wizard took out a light green crystal from his pocket. The front desk staff in the hotel was a sweet-looking young elf. When they saw the crystal, they immediately called for the hotel owner, who warmly arranged 10 rooms for them. Even the young wizard exchanged it for a big bag of kolars. The young wizard casually counted 50 coals and handed them to Roy. Roy hesitated a bit and didn't go to pick him up. This was a lot of money for Roy. "Take it, I'll ask you to take us to a more reliable tavern later." The young wizard forced this pile of kolars into Roy's hand and said with a smile. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Taverns. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5. Taverns. Roy walked along Brown Street with this group of crew members. The port cities in the elf world are quite unique, with many buildings built beautifully, but these houses facing the street cannot see the gardens in the backyard. Even if elves have a yard, they usually don't plant vegetables in it. They like to cultivate some flowers and plants, and then trim them neatly, at most planting 1 or 2 fruit trees. Horticulture is also an art form for elves. The crew would always curiously scrutinize the exquisite buildings, and they would also stare at the elf women non-stop. Whether young or elderly, they would first glance at their faces and then look down their necks, chest, slender waist, buttocks. Occasionally, they would communicate with each other in imperial language that Roy couldn't understand. Perhaps due to drinking the juice of the world tree, even if elf women live for 600 or 700 years, they will not appear very old. At most, there are some less obvious wrinkles on certain parts of their faces. For these crew members, they couldn't tell at all that the elf woman in front who was watering the flowers was over 200 years older than his great-great-grandmother. These crew members become very careful when they hear Roy introduce street shops. Everyone even stopped in front of Mrs. Winnie's pharmacy on the street corner for a while. The shelves outside the pharmacy were filled with flower pots, which were not common flowers, but some magical herbs that Roy couldn't quite distinguish. According to Ms. Belinda, these basic knowledge are something that Roy needs to slowly learn after going to school. However, this group of people obviously stayed at the entrance of the pharmacy for a little longer. Although they appeared to be quite restrained, Roy still saw the longing in their eyes. The young wizard introduced himself as Benjamin, and Roy couldn't communicate with the other crew members, so he didn't need to know each of their names. In fact, even the name of the young wizard, Roy felt like it was fake. Every time he shouts Benjamin, the young wizard's reaction is not so timely, not that instinctive reaction. The explanation given to Roy by magician Benjamin was that this was the first time someone had called his name in Elven language. Given the generosity of these crew members, Roy is not prepared to argue with them. "I only know where there is a tavern, but I haven't actually been inside either. Roy said to the young wizard Benjamin. Magician Benjamin invited Roy and said, "Why don't we go in and see each other later? I know there's a very reputable tavern." Roy pointed to a semi-open-air tavern at the end of Brown Street. This is the end of Brown Street, and the tavern is built facing the cliff facing the sea. The terrace hangs outside the cliff and is considered a great viewing deck, with half of the terrace hidden under the shade of trees. If you want to go to the beach from here, you have to detour around the back alley and walk a long section of stone steps. Elves are adept at designing such ingenious buildings and enjoy incorporating natural scenery into gardens. This tavern is very atmospheric. It is a very simple-looking small house, filled with various wine utensils, and a mixed aroma of wine can be heard from the door. There are only 6 tables on the terrace with a sea view, and there are not many people inside the tavern at this time. Magician Benjamin came to the terrace and leaned against the railing, just enough to see the bustling dock. He excitedly said to Roy. "Yes, that's the place. We need a small tavern like this to have a good drink. You may not imagine how boring it is to have sailed on a ship for a whole year and a half. The Silver Moon Elves usually like to drink tree juice, and these alcoholic beverages are brought from the Dark Moon Elf Kingdom." The waiter walked over with a wine list filled with elf text, a dark moon elf with a slightly gray skin. She was clearly a bit timid and kept staring at Roy. It seems that only Roy can give her a sense of security among these people. Roy had seen her on the street, but he didn't know she was actually working in this tavern. The specialty drink here is a sparkling wine, and the price is indeed very affordable. The crew members divided it into 2 tables, each with 2 bottles of sparkling wine and stronger rum ordered. As for the appetizers, there were only some dried fruits and fish, and no other food. The moment the cork was opened with a bang, the sparkling golden wine was poured into the cups in front of the crew. The only waitress in the tavern stood behind the bar, looking curiously at the group of human crew members. "This elf looks pretty good," with a faint oil paint on his lips. When he sat down next to the bar, there was no disgust or disdain in his eyes. Everyone sat down and had a glass of sparkling wine, and the conversation clearly became more lively. Roy didn't drink alcohol. Because this matter was explicitly prohibited by Ms. Belinda, she even forbade Roy from touching the edges of the bar. In Ms. Belinda's eyes, Roy was just a child who could only drink the juice of the world tree. "How do you solve the food problem?" "I mean when you're sailing at sea," Roy asked curiously. Magician Benjamin took a sip of wine and said with a satisfied expression. "What's wrong with this? The fish in the sea are caught casually. Who doesn't know that fish in the sea can be caught casually?" Roy roast in his heart. "Can you eat vegetables on the boat as I mentioned?" Roy continued. Magician Benjamin suddenly straightened his chest, his face filled with pride and superiority, and answered. "Of course, my career is as a botanist, and I also need to cultivate some fast-growing vegetables on board. The cabbage and tomatoes I grow on board are also good." Roy continued to ask curiously, "So what about freshwater? If we can't find islands and ports, what if we run out of freshwater stored on the ship for such a long journey, and rely on receiving some rainwater to make a living?" Benjamin looked at Roy with a surprised expression, confirming that he really didn't know before explaining. "I thought the elves would be more advanced in this area than us." The magician molded around his waist and then took out a silver-plated square board from his pocket. He covered the silver-plated square board with engraved patterns on one side facing upwards, and placed a thin piece of crystal stone in the gemstone groove. With the patterns on the square board, some strange magical lines lit up, and small water droplets condensed from the square board. Seeing these small water droplets splashing onto the silver-plated metal plate, Roy realized that they were sailing at sea, relying on magical magic to provide water sources. "Do you have this kind of magical metal plate that won't run out of drinking water during navigation?" Roy asked. After removing the thin piece of crystal, Magician Benjamin carefully wiped the silver-plated metal plate with a handkerchief before saying, "Not only that, many times we even rely on it for bathing." Roy felt that these things were all novel in his heart, but at the same time, there was a hint of disappointment. This world was really different from his original one. "How long have you been here?" Magician Benjamin took another sip of his wine. The sailors next to them started chatting on their own. Their voices were a bit loud, seriously damaging the originally quiet atmosphere in the tavern. Fortunately, there were not many people inside. In fact, there was still a drinker sitting in the corner, and there was also a rum bottle on the table in front of him. Most of the rum inside had already been drunk, looking a bit drunk. He lowered his head and counted the few nuts left on the plate, looking bored. Just looking at his profile, Roy felt a bit familiar. "I was born here and have been living here ever since," Roy said casually. Benjamin asked with envy, "Did you grow up in the Elven Kingdom?" Roy nodded, not understanding why he had to repeat the question. "Have you ever been to Buenos Aires?" Benjamin pursued. Roy immediately shook his head. The young wizard was somewhat disappointed and took another sip of sparkling wine. On the counter of the tavern, there is a conch that can only hear the singing of sea monsters. It looks magical, but in reality, there is a magic crystal hidden inside the conch. The magic crystal is engraved with a set of inscriptions, which is very common here. Mrs. Winnie, the owner of a pharmacy on the street, also has one. The music is a bit more explosive than this. The elves drinking in the tavern are very quiet, and few people sit together like this group of sailors, talking loudly. In the eyes of the elves, this behavior is also crude. Roy couldn't help but glance at the drunken man sitting in the corner. The reason he noticed him was entirely because he had appeared in the yard of the neighboring Ms. Gillian. Besides selling fish, Ms. Gillian's favorite thing to do is to date different male elves and occasionally take them home for the night. This elf, who looked a bit drunk, Roy had seen him more than once, and his appearance was a bit special, with a slightly dark complexion. He should be a dark moon elf, and Gillian called him Jefferson. Jefferson was wearing a somewhat old light leather suit, and his hair had not been taken care of for a long time, making him look a bit messy. He seemed to be waiting for someone, with half a glass of rum in front of him, never finishing it all, only taking a shallow sip each time. Roy felt that he definitely didn't want to step up at this moment and say hello to him. He was a bit drunk and kept muttering something in his mouth. After finishing his last sip of wine, he glanced vaguely at the empty glass in his hand and skillfully tapped his left finger with a crisp snap. The young waitress in the tavern quickly walked over holding the wine list. She bent down as much as possible and placed the wine list in front of him, waiting for him to choose a type of wine. Drunk Jefferson embraced the soft waist of the waitress with one hand and grabbed her little hand with the other, whispering something in his mouth. The elf waitress shook her head repeatedly to refuse, but Jefferson still persisted, his hand already gripping the elf waitress's wrist. %UN, amp, %UN #. "Stop, let go of that girl," a crew member from the adjacent table shouted loudly. He spoke Imperial language, and Roy couldn't quite understand it. But then Roy saw his indignant expression on his face, stood up suddenly, rushed towards the table in the corner, and reached out his hand to press Jefferson's shoulder. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. Disputes. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6. Disputes. Jefferson struggled to stand up. He has some fighting skills and even pulled out the long dagger from his boots while struggling. Roy guessed that he must have the bloodline of the Dark Moon Elf. When he struck, he was fierce and fast, and the angle was extremely sharp. The moment the dagger flipped over between his wrists, it easily pierced the soft leather vest on the left rib of the crew member and penetrated through the edge of the 11th rib. The crew didn't expect the drunken elf to act so harshly. When he realized it, he felt a sharp pain in his chest diaphragm and even difficulty breathing. He endured the excruciating pain and grabbed the handle of the long dagger, attempting to kick Jefferson away with one foot. At this moment, Jefferson had already pulled out the blood-stained dagger and quickly rolled back, ready to jump down the railing of the suspended terrace into the dense bushes below. The crew member's hand stained with blood was also cut off with a sharp dagger, but his palm still pressed against the bleeding wound. The other crew members noticed the struggle here and immediately surrounded Jefferson. Seeing our crew members being stabbed in blood by the drunken elf, they became less calm. With a few loud shouts, the crew was filled with a clear and visible fighting spirit, and they almost simultaneously rushed towards Jefferson. Although Jefferson extended his hand quite well, there were more than 10 crew members who cooperated very well with each other. When they pounced, they almost blocked all Jefferson's escape routes, and someone rushed to the front of the railing first. The battle started and ended. 4 crew members simultaneously pounced on Jefferson, pressing him tightly onto the terrace floor, grabbing the messy curls on Jefferson's head, lifting it up suddenly, and hitting the floor again fiercely, instantly causing Jefferson's head to break and bleed, and his previously struggling limbs to become weak and powerless. Surrounded by a dozen crew members, they dragged Jefferson into the alley behind the tavern. The blood flowing from Jefferson's head dripped on the floor, forming intermittent lines. Roy, like the waitress in the tavern, was standing next to her and was almost scared to death. The owner of the bar also ran out of the wooden house filled with wine barrels. Magician Benjamin squatted beside the crew lying on the ground, reciting short spells while unfolding a magic scroll. Glows poured down one after another, and the expression on the crew member's face became even more painful. How troublesome. Benjamin muttered and poured a bottle of pale red medicine into the crew member's mouth with a look of regret. This magical potion, Roy has seen it in Mrs. Winnie's pharmacy. The strong crew member walked out quickly from behind the tavern and said 2 words in Imperial language to Benjamin quickly. Benjamin was also stunned and quickly asked a question before starting to help the lying crew member bandage his wound. They move quickly and don't have time to talk to Roy on the side. The crew members who rushed back from behind all had gloomy faces, and some even stared at Roy, the tavern owner, and the waitress with unfriendly eyes. When all the crew members in the alley returned, they did not stop in the tavern, but walked straight towards the tavern gate at a fast pace. The seemingly strong crew member, with the help of others, picked up the injured crew member and followed closely behind them as they walked out. There was no one in the tavern to stop them. Magician Benjamin didn't say anything more. Before leaving, he just patted Roy's shoulder and casually placed a stack of coolers on the table, taking away the few bottles of unfinished sparkling wine. He walked at the back, and the crew at the door were clearly waiting for him. They ran very fast, not following Brown Street towards the city, but following the stone steps that extended towards the seaside along the edge of the tavern, and drilling into the dense forest. At this moment, the brave waitress who took the opportunity to check the situation behind the alley let out a scream. Ah! Roy has a big head and things seem to be getting worse. This was Roy's first time witnessing someone wielding a knife in front of him, and there was no intense fighting scene. Both sides were very fierce, from bleeding to the crew slipping away in less than a quarter of an hour. At this point, it was already too late for Roy to leave. In fact, he couldn't just pat his butt and leave like this, because both the tavern owner and the waitress knew him. Everyone lives on Brown Street, and even if they can't name each other, they often meet each other. Jefferson collapsed behind the alley of the tavern, his neck wiped by the crew, his tattered leather armor stained red with blood, his clothes still on, his bloody dagger in hand, and the money in his pocket, even though there were not many coolers in that pocket. The tavern owner seemed very calm. While he asked Roy to stay, he ran out to find the elf patrol of Castleton Harbor. Roy just saw 3 elf guards handling cases at the Temple of Liberty. At this moment, he saw 3 elf guards hurriedly rushing over here, wearing light armor and elf swords on their waists, looking very brave and extraordinary. Roy thought to himself. These elf guards are really busy. But at this time, he didn't dare to complain at will, just sat beside the waitress honestly. The elf patrol began to confirm Jefferson's identity, and Roy discovered that the tavern owner and waitress also knew the deceased Jefferson. Then several elf guards began investigating the cause of the incident. According to the owner of the tavern, touching a little hand is nothing, and besides, Jefferson and Lucy know each other at all. The reason why the two had some arguments was because Jefferson wanted to credit a glass of wine, and the waitress Lucy was worried that she wouldn't accept it later and didn't want to pay for him. And those human warriors would fight Jefferson, completely helping Lucy out of the siege, but Jefferson's reaction was a bit extreme. He stabbed the group of human warriors, and someone fell first. That group of enraged humans only temporarily dragged Jefferson into the back alley. Everyone thought Jefferson would get beaten up and wait for the elf guards to come over, but I didn't expect that those human warriors were also very tough, directly wiping Jefferson's neck. The tavern owner objectively described the incident without favoring anyone. Miss Lucy, the waiter at the tavern, looked aggrieved. Frankly speaking, I met this dark moon elf Jefferson at an open-air square dance. After getting tired from dancing twice, Lucy took Jefferson home for the night, and the elves believed in the emotions that burst out from this brief interaction. However, later Lucy discovered that Jefferson didn't have a serious job and would always take on some obscure tasks to earn some small money. Often, when he had money, he would spend it casually, and when he ran out of money, he would tighten his belt and go out to find work. Jefferson has been on a tight budget these days, and he hasn't paid much attention to him these past few days. In this situation, Jefferson would almost always disappear quietly for a few days, and when he had plenty of money, he would reappear holding a bouquet of flowers. But I didn't expect this guy to come to the tavern in the morning, sit there for half a day, and still insist on not leaving. If it weren't for him pestering Lucy and wanting her to treat him to another drink, nothing would have happened afterwards. The elf patrolman who recorded these things looked at the waitress with a disdainful expression on his face, and there was no eye contact throughout the entire process. A white-faced elf patrolman sat across from Roy, with 2 glasses of water on the table. The elf patrol has a sharp gaze and likes to stare into Roy's eyes when asking questions. He asked Roy many questions. Roy answered truthfully. For example, if both parties meet at the dock and agree to be their guides, for example, this group of crew members opened several rooms in a wooden inn before running to the sea tavern to drink. For example, they came over on a 5-masted sailboat and just got off the ship. The elf patrol held a delicate goose feather pen and recorded Roy's words word for word on a white paper. "If we have anything, we will come to you again," the elf patrol said to Roy with a stern expression. Roy nodded honestly, and after being questioned by the elf patrol, he stood on the side dejected. It's not worth it to be inexplicably involved in such a chaos in order to gather information about the outside world. The elf guards took Jefferson's body away. The life of the elves is very precious, but the guards will continue to investigate this matter, but now there are not enough manpower, and they are not in a hurry to pursue the group of criminals. Of course, no one will admit that this has anything to do with Jefferson being a dark moon elf. The tavern didn't seem to be affected by this, and before the elf guards left, the waitress started wiping the blood stains on the floor with a mop. The tavern owner also returned to the wooden cabin of the tavern to rest. The tavern has no losses, and the elf guards will track down the culprit based on existing clues, and no one will pay attention to Roy. Roy realized that he had nothing to do and walked outside the tavern. He happened to come across a slightly frail elf timidly avoiding the 3 elf guards. He was holding a package in his arms and walked in from outside, probing his head. When he passed by Roy, he casually glanced and saw that his pants were still stained with a few basil leaves, as if he had just crawled through the forest. His hair was messy and hadn't been washed for a long time. He was worried that his hair would curl up, so he took some water and forced it down. Stepping out of the tavern, Roy suddenly stopped and remembered that the only place nearby with basil trees was outside the walls of the Temple of Liberty, and there was no such thing in other places. "I saw the person climbing over the wall around the Temple of Liberty this morning. Could it be him?" End of this chapter. Chapter 7. Sabrina. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7. Sabrina. Leaving the tavern, Roy had originally planned to visit the Magic Guild next to the Upper City Elf Academy. There are junior appraisers there who can help people identify various artifacts related to magic. Roy plans to identify whether the flame in his palm is magic, and if it is, he plans to study some subjects related to magic. Only when he reached the intersection of Brown Street did he realize that there were 2 elf guards standing at the intersection, who were investigating pedestrians entering Brown Street. The entire Brown Street is under martial law, and only allowed in and not allowed out, causing panic among the residents on the street. Mrs. Winnie, the owner of the street corner pharmacy, stood on the steps outside the shop, looking bored at the 2 elf guards while chatting with the owner of the neighboring fruit shop. The night-blade leopard, lying in her arms, stared fiercely at Roy, with its amber eyes filled with vigilance. The neighbors on the street all ran up to the street, discussing what had happened. Surprisingly, the elf patrol came and put the entire Brown Street under martial law. Since he couldn't leave Brown Street for the time being, Roy walked home. As soon as he arrived at his doorstep, Roy saw a beautiful elf wearing a white silk dress with her arms wrapped around a few books and a pair of sandals with straps wrapped around her legs. She walked towards the street corner with a cluck 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 sound. The legs wrapped in the skirt were really long, and a small piece exposed was as fair as ivory. She is Sabrina, the eldest daughter of the neighbor Ms. Gillian, and is one of the few tall elves, at least 1 head taller than Roy. Her skin is fair, and her eyes are like 2 magnificent emerald grandmothers. Only wood elves in the elf race have green eyes and a tall figure. However, Sabrina inherited the delicacy of the silver moon elf in other parts of her body, such as a straight nose bridge, crystal clear pointed ears like Moira. The neighbors believe that Sabrina is a hybrid elf of silver moon elves and wood elves. Of course, it goes without saying that the mother is Ms. Gillian, who makes a living by selling fish, while her father, it is speculated, should be a wooden elf. Ms. Gillian never mentions Sabrina and Moira's father. Although they are sisters, their sister has the blood of wood elves, while the other sister has a little blood of dark moon elves. Roy is not very familiar with his sister Sabrina, but on the contrary, he has a good relationship with his sister Moira. Sabrina is studying at the Castleton Elf Academy and is also a member of the choir at the Temple of Liberty. She is rarely at home. Moira is a very introverted elf, even a bit autistic, always keeping herself at home. Good afternoon, Sabrina. Roy actually prefers to call her a big white goose, but once shouted like this, it will definitely anger Sabrina. As long as she catches him, Roy will inevitably get beaten up. Especially after she went to school, Roy couldn't beat her no matter what. After being scolded a few times, Roy's mouth became much more honest. Sabrina, standing outside the courtyard door, turned her head and saw that it was Roy. She quickly glanced at Roy and turned around before entering the courtyard. It's always like this. She walked into the yard with her head held high and her sexy body wrapped in a skirt rhythmically moved with every step taken, leaving only Roy with a large silhouette. The 2 courtyards are actually separated by a low wall. Roy put the bucket into the kitchen, put away the fishing rod and hook, and washed his feet when he heard Sabrina's voice next door. Moira, where are you? Sister, I'm upstairs. Roy thought about the clothes he had hung on the terrace last night and climbed barefoot to the 2nd floor. I happened to see Sabrina climbing up the 2nd floor on the adjacent terrace. She put a paper bag on the small table in front of moi Lamian noodles and sat down on a square stool beside moi. Moira saw Roy appearing on the opposite terrace, glanced at him, put down the book she was holding, and then asked her sister Sabrina. Why did you come back so early today? Her voice is a bit rusty, probably due to her skin color. She usually likes to wear black dresses. Sabrina casually shook off her sandals and curled her feet up in the lounge chair, lazily stretching her slender body before saying. The Statue of Liberty Temple was stolen last night, and all activities today have been cancelled. I don't know what happened on Brown Street, and the whole street is under martial law. I can't go to the fish market to help, so I have to come back. Moira was somewhat surprised and covered her mouth with her hand, then asked softly. The Holy Grail in front of the temple's holy pool. Sabrina casually glanced at the opposite terrace and noticed that Roy had already left with his dry clothes in his arms before nodding and saying, "That's it. Usually, it's filled with a glass of water. Occasionally, when someone comes to pray, the priest will pour them a glass." Moira blinked and said, "How do they remember stealing this? Probably for the gold and gemstones on it, who knows?" Sabrina appeared indifferent. Although she was a member of the temple choir, the loss of a holy grail in the temple had little to do with her. Anyway, it wasn't that old organ that was lost. She was a bit distracted and didn't expect an annoying guy to appear next to the railing on the adjacent terrace. "Have you caught the thief who stole the holy grail?" Roy asked Sabrina. If it weren't for his curiosity, Roy wouldn't have come forward to talk to Sabrina. Every time the two communicate, Sabrina doesn't have a good expression. However, Sabrina did not provoke Roy this time, but put away her lazy appearance and said with a stern face, "No, you also know how outstanding those guards are. How could they be caught all at once?" Roy habitually retracted his head and responded with a sentence. "That's it too." Next, Roy ran downstairs to take a shower and changed into refreshing clothes. In the summer of Port Castleton, there is a cool sea breeze, so it is not very hot. On days without air conditioning and fans, lying in bed with the window open feels very comfortable. At dinner time, Roy ran to the kitchen and made a stewed fish for dinner. Roy ate it alone. Ms. Belinda did not come back, probably due to the busy art museum. After it was completely dark, Ms. Gillian pushed the cart back from the fish market. The two elf guards also ran to the house of Ms. Gillian next door and chatted with her for a while, as if investigating Jefferson who died during the day. Roy waited until the two elf guards left Ms. Gillian's house and ran to the terrace, holding onto the railing and asking the elf guard outside the gate, "Have those sailors not been caught yet?" The two elf guards stopped in their tracks, which were exactly what they had seen in the tavern during the day. They didn't want to say anything at first, but when they saw it was Roy, one of them stopped and replied, "Not yet. The other party has diplomatic immunity." "Oh." Roy agreed. The elf patrol asked casually, "Do you know Jefferson?" Roy calmly replied, "I saw him at the street corner before, but we haven't talked." "Okay." The elf patrol felt that they couldn't find any useful information on Roy, so they glanced at each other and walked towards the next door. They also had to investigate other residents on Brown Street tonight. "Hello. Hello. Hello." Roy also wants to talk to the two elf guards about the theft of the Temple of Liberty, but the elf guard left the neighbor's yard without looking back and walked into the neighboring house. At night in Castleton, the sea breeze cools the entire city. Many times, Roy would lie on the chair on the terrace like he does now, chatting with Moira on the opposite terrace. When it comes to his experiences during the day, Roy can only describe them as terrible. At night, Moira may feel more secure under the cover of the night. So she is more lively at this time than during the day. And when she's in a bad mood and doesn't plan to come out to meet someone, even if she's standing on the terrace, Roy can't find her. I don't know when Roy got used to telling Moira about some of his experiences during the day. For example, today I met that group of sailors, and later during the fight in the tavern, Roy spoke out all at once. At night, Moira's eyes are very bright. Although the two terraces are about 5 meters apart, Roy can still see that her eyes seem to be a bit shiny. She had just taken a shower and was wearing a loose tube skirt, with her wet hair hanging loose. A small face appears particularly pure, except for a slightly dull skin. Everything else inherits Ms. Gillian, more like a silver moon elf in the silver moon elf kingdom. The status of mixed-race elves is lower than that of semi-elves like Roy, and they are more susceptible to criticism. "I understand." Moira only said one sentence all night. The lights on the distant seaside pier are brightly lit, and the tide will rise after midnight today. Ms. Gillian rested early after dinner and will arrive at the pier around midnight to pick up the fish. The lives of the elves in the lower class society are usually very difficult. Although Roy doesn't quite agree with her various attitudes towards life, he admires her hard work. She is the kind of person who is particularly dedicated to life, insisting on selling fish at the fish market on the dock every day to support her 2 daughters. Moira was taken care of by her like a flower in a greenhouse. Compared to Ms. Gillian, Roy's mother appears more casual and often leaves Roy alone at home. Moreover, this half-elf son has become another Roy for so long that he has not even noticed it. Over the past year, Roy has gradually integrated into this environment. Thinking of going to the Magic Guild tomorrow to identify the flame that always appeared in the palm of his hand, Roy lay eagerly in bed and fell asleep. End of this chapter. Chapter 8. Appraisal. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. Appraisal. The Magic Guild of Castleton City is located in the Upper City District, adjacent to the Castleton Elf Academy, which is almost the place with the strongest learning atmosphere in the city. Young elves running on the streets holding books can be seen everywhere, and the Bishop's Building of the Elf Academy and the Mage's Tower of the Wizarding Union complement each other here, becoming one of the most eye-catching landmarks on the west side of the Upper City. Young elves usually go to the Elf Academy to study. Whether it's the Silver Moon Elf or the Half-Blood Elf, as long as you have the willingness to learn and pay the full tuition fee, you can come here to study. Ms. Belinda is planning to have Roy go to school here. Many elves first find a job to earn a semester's tuition after reaching adulthood, and then attend an elf academy. Some elves work and study at the same time, as long as they don't enroll in so many subjects every semester, so they can still maintain their part-time work and study. Of course, there are also those with better family conditions, such as those elf nobles who do not need to consider tuition fees. They only need to focus on studying in the academy, and these students often learn more comprehensive subjects. Roy originally needed to find a job and earn enough tuition fees like other ordinary elves before going to school. But Belinda's mother believed that Roy only had half the lifespan of elves, and if he had to work like other elves during his studies, the time he had to enjoy life would probably be greatly reduced, so she planned to help Roy pay for this tuition fee. Castleton is an open city with no walls around it. More than 90% of the city's areas are built on the mountains by the sea, and from bottom to top, the streets of the city are also layered. All buildings are built against the mountains, and the more you look up, the more luxurious those buildings become. On the mountaintop of Castleton City, there is a huge silver moon elf statue standing nearly 30 meters high. The direction pointed to by the right hand of this silver moon elf statue is the location of Buenos Aires City. Roy, standing on the square in front of the Magic Guild, looked up at the giant statue on the mountaintop, feeling that if it had collapsed, it would likely have fallen here. Setting aside this unrealistic idea, Roy clenched the money bag filled with kohlur in his hand and mustered up courage before walking into the magic tower. The guard at the door did not stop Roy from looking like a human, but only gave him a scrutinizing look. Roy's response to this was to say fluent Elven language. "I'm here for preliminary identification." In such a simple sentence, Roy walked smoothly into the first floor of the Mage Tower, and in fact, the place for the primary appraisal happened to be here. The interior of the first floor of the Magic Tower is divided into many different areas, and you can follow the hallway according to some guide signs. The first impression that Roy has here is that it looks like some first-floor stores. On both sides of the corridor are various shops. And these shops are more or less related to magic, such as pharmacy stores, scroll stores, magic gem stores, magic weapon stores, and so on. There are not only some elf nobles entering and exiting these magic shops, but also students from elf academies and some mages wearing gorgeous robes. Roy found the signpost in the identification area, and as the crowd walked into this area, it seemed a bit deserted. Many of the shops in the forest are related to identification, but many of them are for identifying magical artifacts. Roy walked around here and finally locked in a seemingly unremarkable but constantly frequented junior identification office. Roy stood quietly at the back. Each guest enters the store alone, while others have to wait outside. There were a total of 4 people in front of Roy, who walked out of it one after another with mixed faces. Roy also felt a bit uneasy in his heart. When it was his turn, Roy stood at the door and knocked, and inside came a sound. "Please come in." Roy pushed them aside and walked in. The room was not big, almost filled with bookshelves, with some copper books on top. There was a smell of parchment rotting in the room, and there was a ladder leading upstairs next to the back row of bookshelves. However, Roy didn't need to go upstairs. As soon as he entered, there was a wooden table with several magic crystals on it. A elf mage sat upright behind the table, his gaze very gentle, but also exuding a hint of majesty, making one dare not offend. He was wearing a dark green robe, and Roy noticed that all the gorgeous decorations on the robe were silver, with some dark patterns that could only be revealed at specific angles and under the refraction of light, belonging to a low-key luxury. Roy couldn't tell the age of the elf wizard, and time had not left any marks on his face. "Young man, can I help you with anything?" The elf mage spoke calmly. "I would like to ask you to help me identify whether I have truly comprehended magic." Roy sat down on a somewhat cold chair and extended his right hand, which had rolled up his sleeves. His palm was placed on the table, with a firefly-like glow on the open palm. Seeing Roy's somewhat uneasy face, the elf mage couldn't help but speak out to comfort him. The Silver Moon Elves not only have the talent to be archers, but each elf is also fond of magical elements, and can learn magic with just a little guidance. "I can tell that you are a semi-elf, so if you want to learn magic, you can definitely study at the Elf Academy. After you officially become a magic apprentice, you can register with the Magic Guild." "Can I really do it?" Roy just wants to know if he can become a wizard. He held on to this obsession entirely because of the boy in his memory with lightning marks on his forehead. If you can become a wizard, that would be great. Roy imagined himself holding a magician's book and a cedar wand in his hand. With just a casual flick of the wand, a fireball would float out, making him feel cool. The elf mage hesitated for a moment, but he did not give a definite answer. Then he picked up a magic crystal from the table and slowly approached the tip of the magic crystal towards the faint light in Roy's palm. To the surprise of the elf mage, the magic crystal was almost touching the faint light and had no reaction at all. This magic crystal stick usually lights up even when it comes into contact with a tiny wave of magic, but it shows no response in front of the bright light in Roy's palm. The elf mage then picked up a magic crystal to test the strength of the magic and approached the faint light, but there was still no response. He hesitated for a moment before patting his forehead. "This is not magic." The elf mage came to a conclusion. Roy was originally full of anticipation, but when he heard the elf mage say this, his face's anticipation suddenly collapsed. "However, you can go to the Moon Temple or the Temple of Liberty to take a look." When the elf wizard said this, he paused in the middle. His suggestion was to let Roy go to the Moon Temple, but the Moon Temple in Castleton City is only open to Silver Moon Elves. Half-elves and mixed-race elves like Roy are not allowed to enter and desecrate the moon altar there. So the elf mage changed his mind and suggested that Roy go to the Temple of Liberty to have a look. "The flame in your palm is neither a fire element nor a light element. I guess it may be a divine skill. Although I cannot identify it here, you can go to the temple to ask, and I believe they will welcome a young person who can come into contact with divine skills without enlightenment." The elf mage said to Roy. Roy was a bit at a loss, he had never expected such a result. Even the final appraisal fee was not collected by the elf mage, because he was unable to provide valuable assistance to Roy, so Roy did not need to pay the appraisal fee. Watching the wallet still bulging in his hand, Roy walked out of the primary appraisal office, unsure if he should be happy or disappointed. Seeing Roy walking out from inside, the young elf in the back took the opportunity to walk in. In the Kingdom of Silver Moon, the Moon Temple is the largest temple with the most followers. Almost all Silver Moon elves believe in the goddess of the moon, Elun. However, It is precisely because the Moon Temple is extremely large in scale and worships the goddess who symbolizes holiness, that this temple only accepts followers of the Silver Moon Elves. According to the elf mage, the flame in Roy's palm belongs to the realm of divine magic, so he needs to go to the temple to find the answer. Roy cannot enter the Moon Temple, he can only go to the Temple of Liberty. Speaking of which, the Temple of Liberty was able to spread doctrine in the Elven Kingdom precisely because of its exclusive practice as the Moon Temple. The priests of the Moon Temple pushed the mixed-race elves out of the door, and the Temple of Liberty accepted this group. Therefore, the priests of the Temple of Liberty were able to build a small temple in the lower part of Castleton City. And this temple is not far from Roy's home either. If I had known this, why not go to the temple first? Roy roused in his heart. After he walked out of the magic tower and saw the bright sunlight above his head, his original depression was swept away. Roy even bought a piece of iced watermelon from an ice drink shop across from the Magic Guild Street and ate it while walking along the long street. When returning to Brown Street, it was almost as easy as walking down the stairs and ramps, which was much easier than when we arrived. Roy finished his lunch halfway and went straight to the main entrance of the Temple of Liberty. Remembering the scene of the wall thief I saw yesterday morning, I felt an indescribable feeling in my heart. The gate of the temple is closed, but the side door next to it is open, and there are no clergy guarding the entrance. Roy supported the iron railing of the side door and walked in. This was his first time walking into the front courtyard of the temple. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. Temple. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9. Temple. The Temple of Liberty in Castleton is located on the eastern section of Brown Street near the port in the lower city area, and it is built next to cliffs and cliffs. Due to geographical limitations, the construction of this Temple of Liberty was not significant, but its ability to promote the teachings of the Statue of Liberty in the Elven world where the Moon Temple was prevalent demonstrated the outstanding diplomatic abilities of the Grand Priest Felix Mitchell. However, the reason why the foreign sect of the Temple of Liberty was able to establish itself in the Elven Kingdom is also due to some reasons of the Moon Temple itself. As the largest sect in the Elven Kingdom, the Moon Temple only accepts worship from elves, and has always excluded those mixed-race elves, half-elves, and other races who come to the Elven Kingdom. The lower part of Castle Town is adjacent to the harbor. Although this is only a fishing port, there are still ships docked from the Wood Elf Kingdom and the Dark Moon Elf Kingdom, which is also the fundamental reason for the mixed race of residents in the lower urban area near Castleton Port. Everyone has also become accustomed to this kind of mixed life, and it is precisely this area that naturally became a place for the dissemination of teachings in the Temple of Liberty. Because the residents here also have faith pursuits, the usual followers of this Temple of Liberty are the mixed-race elves and half-elves in the lower city area. As a Silver Moon Elf, Ms. Belinda is a devout believer in the Moon Temple, so Roy hardly ever stepped into this temple. Almost every day, Roy passes by the entrance of this temple and often sees the Statue of Liberty in the center of the vestibule. Stepping into the entrance of the temple, the courtyard is not large in size, except for the statue of the goddess in the center, surrounded by a neatly constructed shrub wall. The ground of the courtyard is covered with terrazzo slabs, and the gaps between these slabs are filled with mortar. At the entrance of the main hall, there are two statues of gods. One of the gods holds a two-handed staff, while the other side of the god waves a flail in his hand, holding a copper book with a half-meter chain. The priest holding a staff on the right is wearing a divine robe, while the priest holding a flail on the left is wearing heavy armor, both of which are very imposing. Perhaps due to losing something yesterday, the figure of a priest appeared at the entrance of the main hall of the temple. He saw Roy walking in from outside the gate, stopped in the yard for a moment, then climbed the steps in front of the main hall of the temple and immediately met Roy. "Sorry, there was no gathering today and the temple is temporarily closed to the public." The priest wearing a dark red robe said to Roy. "I came here to ask the divine officials in the temple to help me identify whether I have divine skills," Roy said to the priest. The priest looked up and down at Roy, paused for a moment before saying, "Then please come with me." He did not bring Roy into the main hall of the temple, but instead walked around the stone path next to the main hall to the backyard. There are many cypress trees planted around the main hall, which are arranged very tightly, more like a tree wall. The main hall of the temple is much higher than these cypress trees, and the outline of the main hall can be clearly seen from the outside, so Roy usually doesn't pay much attention to this row of cypress tree walls. When Roy followed the priest through the dense cypress wall, he realized that there was actually a 3-story clock tower next to the main hall, hidden behind the dense trees, like an attic in the main hall. As he approached, he realized that both buildings were actually independent. There is also a well below the clock tower, but I don't know if it's fresh water inside. On the left side of the clock tower, at the back of the main hall against the wall, a row of 2-story small buildings are connected to the main hall, and the outer side of the small buildings is connected by a corridor. It looks like the residence of the priests. The priest led Roy to the door of the third room in this row of residences, stood outside and knocked on the door. When he heard someone inside respond, he immediately said, "Officer Reed, someone outside wants to test their divinity." The wooden door in front of me was pushed open from inside. A priest wearing a dark red robe with a silver border walked out from inside, wearing a silver crown on his head and holding a scepter with a gemstone set at the top in his hand. The priest named Reed stood in front of Roy, with no wrinkles on his face, and Roy couldn't tell his age. This Reverend Reed is actually a human, which makes Roy feel even more familiar. Living in this city full of elves, Roy felt like an outsider. Despite Ms. Belinda's repeated emphasis that Roy is a semi-elf, Roy feels like he is a human. When Reverend Reed looked at Roy, his gaze was gentle, and he noticed Roy's ears that were different from those of elves. "Follow me." His voice was calm and indifferent. He turned around and walked towards the end of the corridor, then walked up the stairs to the second floor. Roy quickly followed up. The priest who received Roy left. Roy followed Reverend Reed into a room that looked like a confessional. The room was not large and had a communication port on the wall, with a table and 2 chairs next to it. Reverend Reed asked Roy to sit opposite him. Roy sat on the chair, casually surveying the dimly lit room. God Reed placed one hand on the table and took out a magic crystal, a square sand table, and a bronze-framed glass hourglass. Our testing generally consists of 3 steps. First, you need to use magic crystals to check if you have divinity. Even if you don't have it, don't worry. I can also use hypnosis to make you enter a dream and see if you have received the goddess's revelation. Even if there is no revelation, I can teach you some simple prayers. As long as you can recite your prayers fluently before the hourglass shines and gain a hint of holy light, you have the potential to become a novice priest. Because a devout heart will gradually allow you to master these divine arts, the goddess will not abandon any believer, which has little to do with your identity and race. God Reed introduced Roy to the testing process, which seemed really detailed. Roy sat in front of the table, rubbing his hands together and explaining to Reverend Reed. "In fact, it's like this. So the appraiser from the Magic Guild asked me to come here and give it a try." After speaking, Roy ignored Officer Reed's indulgent expression and extended his right hand to lay flat on the table, only slightly focused. A firefly-sized flame appeared in his palm. Reverend Reed looked at the holy light in Roy's palm with some surprise, and then even condensed a candlelight-like glow on his fingertips. He leaned his finger towards it and gently pushed it, and the 2 lights merged harmoniously into one. This is indeed the holy light, indicating that you have the ability to learn divine spells. It's great, this light is very pure. When Reverend Reed looked at Roy, his eyes lit up. I was also a bit excited when speaking. "What's your name?" "Roy." "Roy, are you willing to learn magic from me?" Father Reed asked with sincerity. If a devout believer heard Father Reed's question, he would definitely agree without hesitation. But Roy is not. He is just here to identify what the light cluster in his palm is, so that when he enters the Elf Academy, he can choose a subject that is more suitable for him. I want to ask, what are the benefits of learning magic? Do you want me to join the temple? What are the rules of the temple? Roy hesitated and asked. Reverend Reed was somewhat surprised. He didn't expect the young man in front of him to not immediately agree, but instead ask several questions in a row. The power of holy light that can be condensed in daily life is almost always through reciting prayers. They belong to those who have a certain foundation and believe in the goddess of freedom. Obviously, Roy is not like this. He came over to identify it because he had the power of the holy light in his body. Officer Reed clarified this relationship and his mood calmed down. Let me answer your first question. Isn't learning itself a benefit? Reed asked Roy in reverse. Roy shrunk his neck and muttered to himself, it's indeed a good thing, but I'm going to school soon, so I can't learn on both sides at the same time. Seeing Roy drooping his eyelids and staring at the table without speaking, Reverend Reed knew that what he said did not move Roy. Learning magic does indeed require joining our Temple of Liberty, and then you will become a trainee priest in the temple, continued Father Reed. There are currently only 3 priests and 2 probationary priests in the temple, so Reverend Reed is urgently looking to recruit new probationary priests. He continued, once you become a novice priest, you need to abide by the rules and regulations of the temple, but those rules are very lenient and will not affect your real life. He paused for a moment and then said, besides, after becoming a novice priest, you can also enjoy many convenient conditions in the temple. I thought this would pique Roy's interest, but Roy just looked up at Reverend Reed, as if he wanted to listen quietly. For example, you can freely enter and exit our library here, said Reverend Reed. Roy can only secretly roast at the library of the Elf Academy is twice as large as the main hall of the Statue of Liberty Hall. What is a library? Learning magic can enhance one's own strength, said the priest Reed. After speaking, he felt that this was not vivid enough, so he raised his scepter and recited a prayer to Roy. Then a beam of light fell on Roy's body. Roy felt a refreshing sensation all over his body, as if he had just taken a shower, lying on the terrace at night, with sea breeze blowing. Is this just divine magic? After achieving success in their studies, open a bathing center in the upper city area of Castleton. Roy was a bit confused, feeling that there was really no need to waste time here. How about? Should we consider it? Since you have the holy light, it means you were born a priest. Officer Reed sat across from Roy and said proudly. End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Apprentice Gods. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 10. Apprentice Gods, but I have already registered at the Elf Academy. I am planning to go to the Elf Academy next week and may not have time to come here. Roy said politely. Then he prepared to bid farewell and leave. Now he is hesitating whether to pay Reverend Reed 100 coals or compensate him through donations. Reverend Reed noticed that Roy was not very interested in what he was saying, and after some thought, he said. After becoming an apprentice priest, you have 2.5 days a week to read here, but you cannot take the books out of the study room. He stood up and walked to the door, waving to Roy. Waiting for Roy to follow, the two of them left the confessional room. Reverend Reed took Roy to a room closest to the main hall in the second-floor corridor. After entering the room, a strong musty smell rushed towards them. The room was filled with bookshelves, and there was also a wooden ladder at the door for easy access to books. Some of these books are prayer books, as well as some history about the Temple of Liberty and some guides to divine spells and spells. Although it is not very useful to outsiders, it is very precious to the priests. Since Roy has not yet joined the Temple of Liberty, he can only stand at the door and look inside to confirm that what God Reed said is true. However, Roy still lacks interest in this. During this period, the goddess has not issued an oracle. Not only did the believers recite their prayers, but the Statue of Liberty did not respond, and even the enlightenment ceremony held here in the temple failed to make the believers perceive the holy light. After 2 rounds of personnel transfers in the past 6 months, the Statue of Liberty Temple currently only has 5 people, including novice priests. Just the night before yesterday, the Holy Grail in front of the temple's holy pool was stolen. If it weren't for the shortage of manpower, such an embarrassing situation would not have occurred. Officer Reed felt that the Temple of Liberty urgently needed to increase its personnel, and the young man in front of him was the best choice. Finally met, where would Roy easily slip away? Roy's lack of heart rate indicates that the conditions offered were not sufficient, so Reverend Reed continued. You only need to attend 2 prayers per week. In addition, there are 3.5 days for you to learn magic with me. Roy found that 7 days a week was packed with schedules, and he had to go to school, so he didn't have time to do anything else. The two stood in the corridor on the 2nd floor, and Roy looked at the staircase at the corner, thinking about how to say goodbye. If you become an apprentice priest, you can still receive a subsidy of 400 coals per week, continued Father Reed. Roy's prepared excuse was immediately swallowed back into his stomach. He lifted his head and looked at Reverend Reed, who had a hopeful expression on his face, and readily agreed. Okay, I think I am very suitable for this. Oh. Very suitable for being a novice priest. Reverend Reed did not expect Roy to change his mind so quickly. Seeing that he readily agreed, he was very happy and said. So. Roy, welcome to the Temple of Liberty. Roy originally thought that joining the Temple of Liberty would involve some rituals and so on. Unexpectedly, his name was only added to the list of clergy in the temple, and there were 2 characters in front of the priest. Apprentice. Later, Reverend Reed took Roy to stroll around other buildings in the temple. As the theft case was not closed, the Elf Patrol demanded that the temple keep all the items and decorations in the main hall in their original state. Therefore, Reverend Reed did not bring Roy into the main hall. Lord Reed is the Grand Priest of the Temple of Liberty in Castleton, while the other 2 priests are both deputy priests. The 2 apprentice priests are also students of these 2 deputy priests, but unfortunately, there are no students around Lord Reed. I have finally found a student, of course, to introduce Roy to others. This temple was built under the crown of Felix Mitchell, and it happens to be the 17th in my tenure, Archbishop Reed introduced to Roy. The 2 walked up to the steps of the main hall, and Grand Priest Reed pointed to the stone sculpture holding a 2-handed staff and introduced it to Roy, saying, this statue was created based on Felix Mitchell's coronation. At this moment, the priest whom Roy had seen in front of the main hall steps walked out from the side. Grand Priest Reed quickly said to him, this is Theodore, who is mainly responsible for distributing blessings in the holy pool here. No wonder he crouched at the entrance of the main hall to guard the door. It turned out that the Holy Grail in the holy pool area he was responsible for was lost. Roy quickly bowed to the unlucky Theodore priest, while considering whether to reveal the information he knew to him. If I had known to join the temple today, I should have had the Elf Patrol catch the thief yesterday. Roy has some regrets. The Theodore priest smiled kindly and welcomed Roy. Later, Reverend Reed and Roy met with Reverend Anderson, as well as 2 apprentice priests, Jasper and Abbott, who were doing chores in the backyard. Officer Anderson is mainly responsible for the bi-weekly gatherings in the temple, preaching the teachings of the Temple of Liberty to believers and promoting the glorious deeds of the Statue of Liberty. He and Theodore are both elves, with much more handsome faces than Reed. The other 2 apprentice priests, Jasper and Abbott, were also elves, but they were both mixed-race elves. Roy could see some differences from the Silver Moon elves from their pupils and ears. Perhaps due to the elven race, they did not choose the priest Reed when choosing their mentor. These 2 apprentice priests were wearing white robes, with only some dark red patterns on the collar, cuffs, and waistband, and no hats on their heads. After so long, finally a new member joined, and the 2 young elves were also very happy. Later, Reverend Reed distributed Roy with a set of apprentice priest robes, belts, boots, and even arranged for him to have a small room with only a bed and wardrobe. Although Roy is a trainee priest in the temple, he doesn't need to live in the temple because he still needs to study at the Elf Academy. He only needs to come to the temple every afternoon and leave before dinner. For novice priests, this is already very lenient. Roy thinks this job not only allows for learning, but also offers a stable salary and is close to home. It's really nice. Roy casually familiarized himself with the environment inside the temple and saw that it was getting late. He put the robe and boots of the apprentice priest in his wardrobe and bid farewell to God Reed before walking back home through Brown Street. End of this chapter.